Okay. So we should be recording. Good morning, everyone. Hope you are all doing well. And today we're going to talk about how we can start having conversations with our students about AI, or how we can continue to have conversations with our students about AI. So if you think that I will say things that are helpful during this presentation, you can feel free to take out your phone and scan the little dino so that you can have a copy of these slides. The recording will also be available on the CELT website either later today or tomorrow. John says tonight, so we'll believe him.
Probably this afternoon.
All right, here we go. So I wanted to start with this because I had been doing a lot of reading about, different ways that we could design assignments to like catch our students using AI tools, because if they're not going to be honest with us, then, maybe we don't also have to be honest. But I personally have some feelings about this. So I want to kind of take a minute and talk about this AI detection trick, which went viral about a year ago, where a teacher who was working in a high school shared like this what was like kind of coined as an ingenious way to catch students who were unethically using AI when they weren't supposed to.
And to build trust.
Yes. So one of the things that she did was she wrote about this banana Trojan horse, which basically like she inserted the word banana into like the text body of an assignment, and she made the word really, really small, and she also made the word banana white in white letters so that like you couldn't see it. So when students copied and pasted her assignment into their like AI tool of choice, the word banana would like pop up in what was generated by the AI tool. And she mentioned that this was a really convenient way to like catch students using AI unethically, if they were using it when they weren't supposed to, because she would see the word banana or a sentence about bananas or whatever, and then she would know that like the students were using AI because bananas were not connected to the assignment like in any way, shape, or form, right? So this got a lot of attention about, like I said, about a year ago, and a lot of people were talking about it and praising her for being, like this is such a great way to catch your students, etc. And I can see that, right? I can see, the frustration that kind of comes with grading a writing assignment, and like we know how much time we put into grading and assessing our students' work to find out that like they were unethical in their submission. So like I could see her perspective. I personally want to discourage this sort of thing though, because in a classroom it should be about building trust. It should be about building trust between like the instructor and the students. And if we are essentially teaching them not to trust us, then they are more likely to continue doing these sorts of things because, like what is there to lose? So I wanted to start with this story because it really resonates with me and it, in my own classrooms and in your classrooms too, right? Like thinking about the ways that we get our students to trust us, not only in class, but also out of class as well. So some of the things that we're going to kind of talk about today, transparency is going to be a big theme here. I personally believe the more transparent you are with your students, especially about AI, the more likely it is that you will be able to make those connections and avoid people going behind your back, trying to be sneaky, trying to be unethical. Of course, there are still some circumstances where like you could be the most transparent and the nicest person on the planet and people are still going to, you know, be unethical in your classroom. There's unfortunately nothing that we can do at this point to kind of catch everyone. But starting off with that transparent mindset, I think is a really wonderful way to kind of set the semester and kind of keep going after that. So one of the things that John and I and the university too are encouraging everybody to do is to include a syllabus statement about AI on your syllabus. And this is something that's actually required for this upcoming fall semester. So say something about how you feel about AI in your particular course. This will help guide students, right? Because we've got a whole bunch of different courses with a whole bunch of different faculty who have a whole bunch of different feelings about AI use in their classrooms. And we all have the autonomy to design our own syllabus statements. So make sure that you have something there that talks about what AI looks like in your particular class.
And unlike some campuses, we don't have a campus-wide policy, and most places don't, to be fair. But the context of use is going to be very different for each discipline, each course, and different courses within each discipline. So one of the things we suggest is that you co-create the policy with students, because if they buy into it, they're more likely to accept it and follow up with it.
It can also be really helpful to, you know, if you are teaching a class where AI use is okay sometimes, and that's kind of the case for, you know, like English 102, when I teach that, AI use is okay some of the time, but not all of the time. So what I started doing way back when ChatGPT kind of emerged was I would include guidance on every assignment. So on every single assignment sheet, I would include sort of like an AI statement that, you know, would outline what was okay for this particular assignment. And, you know, sort of just some things that my students should keep in mind as they continue on, especially like if you're in, you know, if it's okay sometimes, but not always. This just kind of increases the transparency between you and like what's happening in your classroom.
And we did have a meeting with the student committee on learning and teaching a while back, where they noted that none of their instructors, for a group of, I think it was about 10 or 12 students, had ever talked about AI and what was allowed or what wasn't. Yeah. But they did say several of them got accused of using AI without having any guidance on it, even though one of the people who were accused said they had never used it, and it was someone who had like a 3.9 GPA. So it is important to provide this guidance. And again, as Stephanie said, including this on each assignment is important. And also going back to the TILT framework, which we talked about in the last session, it's really important that you explain why its use is either allowed or is not allowed.
I'll say too, as a follow-up to that, you know, like when students come in to the writing center for help with their different writing assignments in your courses, one of the very first things that I encourage the writing tutors to do is have them pull up their syllabus so that they can review your AI policy. Because some, you know, students are using AI in different ways. In the writing center, I have talked to the tutors about, you know, how important it is for them to be cognizant of the instructor's AI policy, right? So like in the writing center, we're not encouraging anybody to do anything until we look at what the AI policy is in your course. So if your course says there's no AI, we're not going near it, right? Like if the student says like, oh, but like, can we use it this way? Then we'll say no, because your instructor in this course doesn't want that. But like for us, you know, if there is some guidance in the syllabus, then that can really help the writing tutors help your students like in the most effective way. So like, it's not just in your classroom. I think it's also when your students are seeking out of class help as well. Okay, so one of the other reasons why I think it can be really helpful to have conversations about AI is that we can help our students as they are making choices about how they feel about this technology. So early on, you know, like I started talking about AI in my courses really quickly after it kind of launched, right? So OpenAI did its thing in like November of 2022. And then the next spring semester, I was having conversations in the classroom with my students about what this means, and early on, I remembered being really surprised that not everybody in the class was like all about it. I was like, oh my gosh, like you don't want to use this, like that surprised me, and it shouldn't have, right? But I just assumed that they would all be kind of like all about it, but they're really not. And some of our students have very strong feelings about AI, and some of it depends on like what their own discipline is, right? So like many of like the creative writers, who I work with and know have very strong feelings about AI tools. Many artists, right, have very strong feelings about AI, but students from all of our different disciplines have their own perspectives. So one of the things that I think is important for them to see from us is for us to kind of open up the opportunity for them to kind of talk about what they are observing, and to hear us talk a little bit as well about what we know. So we think about things like data privacy and what that means, again, to connect back to the writing tutors. I did a training with all of them so that they would understand what data privacy is, how OpenAI uses our data in like the free version of ChatGPT, for example, and what that means. What sort of information should you be inputting and what information should you not? Some of our students know this, but some of them like really don't, like John, I think back to, what was it like when we were assuming that all of our students were like tech savvy because like they had smartphones, right? But like they really weren't. They just knew, digital native thing. They just knew how to open up an app like on their phone and use it, right? Like they didn't know how to do the other things. So some of our students are way more informed than others are, certainly. But there are still a lot of questions, and I think that they're looking to us for some guidance as they start to navigate through those things. We can also have conversations about ethics and what that means, in a whole bunch of different ways. We can talk about sustainability and, AI's impact on the environment, but also some other like streaming services impact on the environment as well, for example, and our technology and what that's doing. And then another conversation that's super relevant to them is thinking about what their career is potentially going to look like after they graduate. What is AI doing to your field? What is AI doing to your potential future job? What are you potentially going to need to know how to do in 4 years, right? If we're thinking about freshmen.
For the last 50 years or so, the unemployment rate for recent college graduates was substantially lower than it was for people of the same age. That's no longer true. That gap has decreased, and a lot of it's being attributed to AI as well as uncertainty about the economy. But and going back to the environment, a lot of people are really concerned about that, but it's a tiny fraction of the power use and water use and so forth that goes into streaming video. So if people are going to be upset about using AI tools, they probably should stop streaming Netflix and Hulu and Disney and all those other services out there.
It's interesting too to read, now that more is starting to be published about artificial intelligence and Gen AI in particular, right? It's really interesting, I think, to read the different perspectives that are coming out, right? And those are things, we just spoke in the previous session about, designing assignments that sort of critically consider AI, right? And there are so many different perspectives about what's happening. It's all very relevant, that inserting some of those conversations into your courses might be good opportunities for your students to start thinking critically about artificial intelligence and what it means.
I sat in on a panel from alumni of ours last semester, and there are people who are doing the hiring at a bunch of engineering and other technological or semi-technological corporations. And with one exception of the 4 or 5 panelists, when they were asked about important things that students should know and be doing, it was AI. You should know these sorts of things. You should not just know how to use it, but you should understand the you know, the real implications, where it should be used, where it shouldn't be used, where it might be used more productively or less productively. So to not, you know, to hide your head in the sand, as is the case with most things, you're not doing yourself any favors. And certainly as an instructor, you're not doing your students and advisees any favors by shielding them from this great societal evil, whether it is or not. I mean, it's there.
It's both wonderful and evil, depending on how it's used.
So I guess my sort of like, you know, to summarize sort of the beginning of this thing, right, is basically we should have space in our classrooms to have these sorts of conversations. And I think that it's important for our students to understand that they can talk with us about their uncertainty or ask us their questions, you know, about AI as it continues to kind of evolve and change and do all the things that it does. So I will apologize for the teeny tiny text on this slide, but I wanted to include like a whole statement just as an example. So this is an example syllabus statement, just part of it from my intermediate poetry writing course, where students are not really allowed to use AI that much. And then I will read this as well because I know that the screen is small. So this statement says, one of my favorite parts of teaching is helping students become more confident writers. There have been so many advancements in AI technology recently, and it can be a helpful tool. However, in creative writing, the writing process is messy, and it's important that we embrace that process as part of our development as writers. While AI can generate text on a variety of topics, my role is to help you develop your own ideas as well as navigate the creative process. At this time, many literary magazines and other creative publications are not accepting writing that is generated by AI tools. While this may change in the future, it's important for us to recognize what is valued in this field now. To help prepare you for writing creatively beyond college, most of our assignments will not include generative AI technology. Please do not use Gen AI to produce work for this class. So what I wanted to do with this policy was connect it to like a real world application that my creative writing students would care about, right? Which is many creative writers are interested in publishing their work at some point, right? That's one of the reasons that sort of drives them to write creatively and to take creative writing courses. And as I look through the different literary magazines that are currently out there and their statements and what kind of work they're accepting or not accepting, almost universally, literary magazines are saying like, we don't want work that's been generated by AI. And like, that's it, you know? So for me, in creative writing, and this is a 300 level creative writing course, so many of these students are quite dedicated, they're quite serious about their craft and honing their writing skills. This makes sense to me, right? To say, we're not really going to use AI because when you submit your work for publication, you can't use it for that either, right? So it's practical practice in this particular example. For English 102, it's a little bit different. So I do allow some AI use in English 102, which is just an introductory writing course that many of our students have to take. I won't read this whole thing because there are some similarities between what I said for the intermediate poetry writing class and for this, but I will kind of highlight some of the things that I added here to include like some of that relevance. So the one part in the middle says, when you graduate, you will need to learn how to work with AI, not let AI do the work for you. Because if a bot can do it all, why do we need human employees? With that in mind, some assignments will integrate AI technology while others will not. I will be transparent about when it is and is not appropriate to use AI in this course. You will receive guidelines that clearly outline my expectations for Gen AI use for every assignment. So in this class, because AI is encouraged sometimes, but not all the time, I wanted to let my students know, you know, sort of how I felt about AI in this context. Does anybody on Zoom, to just take a break from listening to me talk, has anybody on Zoom created any syllabus statements about AI that you would be willing to like kind of summarize for us, whether it's some AI use or none, or, you know, like a free-for-all?
At the moment, I am thinking of trying to put an AI statement on an upcoming course for Math 208 Business Calculus, talking about how AI is allowed in this course for the purposes of practicing material that that will help you get better at the procedures, the questions, the applications that you might see in future assignments for the purposes of learning the material better, getting practice with the material. But AI is not to be used by using any material that was written by me or written from the textbook. If you wish to create your own questions, your own topics, your own prompts for AI use to help you out, get you some practice, or to generate some material on your own to practice, that's okay. But when you use other people's material and prompts in AI without their permission, that's a violation of trust and a violation of ethics. And so that will not be tolerated. At the same time, though, I think I have to make sure that I put some kind of statement in there about how when it comes to using AI to practice for exams, students are allowed to create their own questions, but students will be very tempted to use my questions or type those questions into AI prompts to solve them, because I think one thing that happens a lot with students who want to use AI to practice for an exam is that they don't want to type their own question in, or they don't want to ask AI to create a question for them to practice. They want to know how to do my question, the way I phrase it, the way I write it. Because if it's not written the exact same way I write it, the way I phrase it, then there's no reason, then the practice is worthless. I know how to do it when it's phrased like this, but I don't know how to do it when you phrase it like that. And so that's one thing that I think is kind of a problem with AI that I haven't quite gotten a handle on. I don't know exactly how to help the students with that. But I think just the idea that students will have a statement in their, we'll see a statement in the syllabus about how, since this is business calculus, in the world of business, finance, economics, you'll be dealing with people's personal, private, financial information, their numbers, their money, and feeding that information into AI prompts can get you in a lot of trouble. And so therefore AI has its place for help, but it's not something that you should be using in all situations.
I think you raise a lot of important points, Michael. One thing that I would suggest to the really good concern and question that you brought up about the practice problems, it might be worth showing students or giving them even like an appropriate prompt that they could put into like ChatGPT, for example, that would help them prompt the AI tool in a way to get practice problems that would kind of like align with some of the stuff that you're doing in your course. So you mentioned like the wording, for example, or, you know, maybe like what kind of problem. One thing that you could do to kind of encourage that transparency and say like, hey, if you want to use this to help you, here's a sample prompt, right? And then you can kind of adapt it to your own needs.
My only concern there, though, is that, you know, the issue you're talking about is students' ability to transfer things, to take concepts in one situation and apply them in others. And that's actually an area where, you know, because they're going to be doing, if they're going to be working in a field where they're using these tools or using this material, they're going to be faced with a wide variety of problems that may not be phrased exactly as how a particular instructor phrased them. And that's one way in which AI could be used, perhaps not just phrasing in a particular way, but perhaps by generating a wide variety of realistic type problems, authentic type problems, that they can see the relevance of this and just giving them practice and feedback. And this might be a good case for developing a tutorial bot, a Socratic tutor type chatbot, where students can be faced. They can ask it questions, but it will guide them to an answer by helping them understand the reasoning to get to the answer. And that we do have a workshop on that coming up, I think either this week
tomorrow.
or next week. It's all
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Long range planning. But that's, you know, that's the type of thing that AI can do fairly effectively, generating a wide range of problems that are realistic and authentic. And students can see that these are the types of problems they'll have to work with. And students always complain that, you know, that this is phrased differently, but that ability to transfer things, to take the concepts learned in one concept and apply them in other situations is what we're really all trying to aim for. We have to get students, you know, the basic skills first, but explain to them that this is a type of thing they need to be able to do in the future, because they're not always going to see things phrased nice and neatly. There's that whole book about wicked problems and so forth, you know, teaching wicked students, that suggests that it's an area that we've been a little bit weak in. And that goes back to some extent to the whole No Child Left Behind Act and so forth, where people have been teaching students to meet the standardized test type questions that are all in very specific formats. And we need to help students develop that transferability.
And to just follow up, so it might be helpful for transparency's sake then to, you know, like open up an AI tool and show your students during class how they might be able to use it for help develop making their own practice problems, right? Or even show them like a prompt that they could use so that they learn how to work the AI tool so that it doesn't just spit out an answer for them, but that it kind of helps them work. Like you could show them how to use AI like a semi-Socratic tutor, for example. And that would be a transparent way to demo appropriate AI use, like for them to make their own practice problems for your particular course. I think sometimes doing things with your students in the classroom can be a helpful way for them to see, you know, and that also answers some of their questions as well. Okay, so I wanted to go here for a second because we just finished reading this really wonderful reading group book that from this semester that's called 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People, by David Yeager. And one of the things that he talks about are the three major mindsets that we sort of use in our classrooms. And these are relatively self-explanatory, but I'll take a moment just for fun. So if we describe an instructor who has more of an enforcer mindset, right? This is someone who has very high standards in their classroom, but perhaps doesn't offer as much support for their students. So for example, you know, study for this, you know, like study for this test, you know, here's, you know, like you have the notes from, you know, like the last 6 weeks. Don't ask me questions. There will not be a review session. You know, most of you will likely not pass this exam, you know, sort of a thing. Someone who has, that's an extreme example, right? But like somebody who has very high standards, but isn't offering a whole bunch of support for their students outside of like what they might have in their regular classroom. Then there's someone who has more of a protector mindset, who has a lot of support for their students, but perhaps not very high standards. And this one is a really tricky one. I find myself falling into this mindset sometimes because I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. And that's something that I struggled with a lot when I first started teaching, and I'm much better at hurting people's feelings now. But like, it's something I still like really, I have a hard time with it, right? And then the last one is an example of like the ideal instructor, right? Which is someone who has a mentor mindset, which is someone who has high standards in their classroom, but also offers very high support. the reason I'm going here, because I know it feels like a little bit of a stretch, is I believe that, you know, the more transparent we are with our students and the more we have a mentor mindset with what's happening in our classrooms, the more likely we are to kind of like bridge that gap between like us and them, and kind of help them understand why we are asking them to do the different things that we're asking in our classrooms. So one of the things that I learned from this book that I really loved was thinking about the different sorts of feedback that we could give our students and explaining our reasoning for giving the sorts of assignments that we're giving. So for example, one thing that I'm going to try this summer with the EOP summer program is, as I give students feedback, I'm going to say, you know, you got this grade. Let's say it's like a C+, you know, I'm giving you a C+ because, and then talk about the reasons, and then explicitly stating, I believe that you will learn from this and that you will make the suggested changes and that you will do better. I believe this because, and then say something that's like encouraging about that person, about who they are or what they want to do. And then say something about like the payoff, right? Like if you make these changes or if you come meet with me, right? I believe that you will learn from this. And making these really sort of like obvious, but like supportive statements as we give our students feedback is something that like David Yeager did a bunch of studies. He was referring to something that's called wise feedback, and looking at like the effect that this sort of feedback has on our students versus students who don't get this sort of feedback, and how that kind of helps encourage the connection that we're making in our classroom between us and our students. I feel like this connects to AI because we really want that level of connection and transparency. And again, if we're explaining our reasoning for giving an assignment, and you know, like our students understand how this assignment is going to help them in the long run do what they want to do or develop the skill that they want to develop, then we might see less unethical use of AI, right? I believe it's connected very much. It's a great book. So another thing that, and these are mostly just based off of my own assumptions, so or things that I have observed, so please forgive me. But I believe that the two big reasons that we see a lot of AI misuse in our classrooms are it really stems down to these 2 points. The first is we see AI misuse in our courses because our students have a poor grasp on time management. And this could be from any number of things, right? I work a lot with first semester or first year students. And, you know, like we all see sort of how they start to figure out what's what. Sometimes they start to figure it out a little bit too late. Sometimes they figure it out just in time, you know, whatever. But managing their time in college is something that can be really challenging for a whole bunch of people, as you all know. So one of the things that I have tried to do in my courses is to structure them in a way that encourages the time management piece as more like built in. So give them not only resources to help them with time management, and I mean, by resources, like I will take time with my first semester students and have them do that thing where they go through their syllabus and they write down all of the due dates, right? And creating a syllabus that has due dates in it is super helpful, right? So that they can kind of plan ahead.
In general, though, those types of inventions don't always have that much of an impact empirically.
That's
but
true.
Scaffolding assignments,
Yeah.
so that they have a lot of due dates and the reminders about them, and
Yeah.
that the due dates are manageable. So you're not just telling students to turn in a 20-page paper a month from now. You know, make sure that they do it in small chunks, and they're much less likely to run into these problems.
Yeah. So I'll have them, like in my course, for example, they'll have all of the due dates at the beginning of the semester, and the assignments are all scaffolded. So they've got something due, you know, like in a writing course, like maybe, you know, sometimes they'll have something due once a week if it's relatively low stakes and small. Sometimes they'll have things due, you know, like once every 2 or 3 weeks, but they'll have all of those dates sort of like up front. and we'll sort of look at what that means for their time management. Sometimes we'll do work on those assignments during class time to kind of help them stay on track, and spend time kind of just talking about how they're managing their time in general. It's a lift, right? And it also takes away from time in class that could be spent like doing other things. But sometimes I think like with students, especially who are just starting out or just figuring things out, it can be helpful to sort of have those conversations during class time so that, you know, the conversations are being had somewhere, right? So a lot of the time, and I have like a story connected to this, which I'm sure I've said before, so bear with me if you've heard it already. But like a lot of the time, students will sort of turn to AI because they have not managed their time effectively, and now they're stressed out and they're scrambling, right? So I had a student who very clearly used AI on an assignment. And it was very obvious because the student had submitted like 2 other assignments leading up to this moment, that had been completely, like they sounded totally different, right, from what was submitted for this assignment. So I suspected that the student had used AI. I asked the student to come and like chat with me about it, and he did. And, you know, I explained that, you know, like the tone of this thing that he just submitted was very different from what he had submitted previously. And that I was concerned about that tonal shift. And I pointed out like an example about how like some of the sentences were, you know, designed quite differently, etc. Really, that's all I had to do. Like I was pretty much done there, right? And he like immediately was like, yes, like I'm so sorry, like I had like 4 different things due, and like I figured that I could like kind of just use AI to do this one, and you know like the other ones, you know, I just couldn't figure out what was more important. And like he was really upset. So I said like, okay, like this is what we're going to do. We're going to use this as a learning opportunity, and I'm going to let you redo this assignment, right? And I'm going to give you partial credit for redoing the assignment because I want you to understand that, you know, like using AI was wrong, but like, let's use this as a learning opportunity and like redo the assignment, and then we will move on and kind of go from there. And he was so, number one, like really grateful for the opportunity to redo the assignment, even if it was just for half credit, right? And he actually sat in my office and redid the assignment, like in my office, like sitting at my desk. And I think for him, having an opportunity to kind of learn from his mistake and grow from it, like he did not use AI for any of the other assignments in that course. It was very clear that this was like a big learning moment for him. So poor time management is one of the things that I think really encourages our students to turn to AI. And the other one is one that's much harder for us to kind of navigate, which is if we have students who are just disconnected from our course material or from what we're doing in our courses. You know, as somebody who teaches a gen ed course where people have very mixed feelings about being there, I have seen this a lot, you know, and you can't, it's naive to think that we can like convert everyone, right? And you know, get them all to love writing or get them all to love geology or economics or whatever, right? So that one is much more difficult. But one of the things that we're going to kind of go to next is thinking about like, if you do have a student who is disconnected or disinterested in your course, what are some things that we can do to try to help make that connection kind of reestablish? Does anybody have comments or questions so far? I know I'm talking a lot, so I'm sorry about that.
The thing that always gets me about time management is that a lot of times it's not the student's choice. Students have, you know, they work 2 jobs and they're taking 5 classes. They do not have the time to necessarily do everything the way we want them to. I mean, call that a failure of the school system, call that a failure of, you know, the work structure, anything like that. But poor time management often gets misconstrued with, you know, the students being irresponsible. Sometimes the student has no say in that. It's not their fault.
You're absolutely right. There are a whole bunch of life things and other things that are sort of like beyond our control. You're absolutely right.
And for-
I was gonna say the same thing that Michael did. I have a ton of flexibility in my classes. No late work. Like we have the students decide on their own late work policy, etc. So the classes are very flexible. That we have lots of scaffolding, etc. So I don't see AI until we hit the end of the semester, when there is a built-in deadline, and then suddenly a lot of these final assignments end up having a lot more obvious AI in them. There's a lot more stuff because there's a bunch of other stuff impinging on their ability to finish, and there is a deadline that I can't give them flexibility for. And so it does feel like, I agree with Michael. It does feel like a lot of this is not just time management. It really is. There are logistical problems that are very hard for us to kind of solve for them.
I agree. So I went to a presentation last week at CIT when they were talking about one course that was designed 3 different ways. And it was an online course, so like keep that in mind. But the course was designed, the first way it was designed was that every module opened up after 1 week, right? And students had like very clear deadlines, like within that module. And then they basically had to wait for the next module to open up the following week. So it was super scheduled, right? Like all of the deadlines were there. They couldn't move ahead if they, even if they wanted to, like they kind of had to follow like that set schedule. Then the second way the course was designed is that 2 modules opened at a time, and students could pretty much do whatever they wanted within those 2 modules over like a 2 or 3 week period of time. So they could complete all of the assignments. They could complete all of the stuff in the module if they wanted to. They could continue like that first module and do like 1 module and then the next one, right? But they had some more flexibility about how they went through and kind of completed it. And then the last course was based only on completion. So like if a student went through a whole module and finished it, then the next module would open up, and the next one, and the next one, and it kind of went like that. And the person who did the experiment, it was the same group of people, but they kind of went through these 3 different courses like that were designed in these 3 different ways. And then he assessed sort of like the outcome of the whole thing. And what was really interesting is that pretty much everybody had like different opinions about each kind of class structure. The one that was super structured with like week by week, the one that was a little bit more flexible, and then the one that was like sort of like just kind of go through and like do it as quickly as you want. He found that the most positive feedback came from that structure that was in the middle, though, where they had some flexibility and yet some kind of like strict deadline. And he said that the reason that one was the best was that the one where it was sort of like complete at your own pace, the students were saying that was the one that they procrastinated on like the most, because they had other stuff going on in their lives that they had to pay attention to more. So your comments made me think about that, because I was thinking about like, as we design our own courses, what's a good way to do it, right? Like some flexibility and some structure, yes, but then like you both pointed out at the end of the semester, like what does that mean?
As far as the disconnect goes, don't forget that many first semester students are in classes that they got stuck in, despite the fact that on my information sheet, I specifically said, I don't want a philosophy class.
Yep.
And yet you've put me in 2 philosophy classes. Because of the vicissitudes of the schedule, students get stuck with things, particularly first semester students who aren't registering themselves. They get stuck with things that not only are they not all that engaged in, but they might be actively unengaged in from the start. So if you're, as an instructor, if you're not working hard early on to get that engagement, to stoke the engagement, and you're just assuming, well, you're in my class, so you must be interested, on some level. Not really.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, thinking about like our incoming students and how they don't have control over their schedules.
Or
Another-
outgoing students. I'm teaching 208 and 25 of the 30 students signed up are second semester seniors who have emailed me to tell me that this is their last course they need to complete before graduating. There is not going to be any connect between the material and their own personal opinion. They're taking this to get out of school.
And hence the potential for unethical behavior is higher than it would be from a student who is taking it as a sophomore. It's just the way of things. If this is the thing that stands between you and finishing, and you fail the first test honestly, and you see a way of not failing the next test, perhaps dishonestly, the temptation is going to be much stronger.
Absolutely. So I think like just, and it's impossible to plan for and consider like all of these different factors, right? Because we are human after all. But thinking about some of these potential barriers, right? And like what we could do about them, I think is important, especially given what AI can do.
And going back to structure, that one of the things that's especially important is maintaining some degree of structure in terms of deadlines and so forth. There was a study done at MIT about 15 years ago where students had to write 3 papers for an economics course, actually. And in one case, students were given the option of picking their own deadlines, and if they didn't meet the deadline, there was going to be a penalty of 1 point per day out of a 100-point scale. And in the other class, the deadlines were fixed. And one of the things they were looking at is to what extent having deadlines versus having some looseness and flexibility affected student performance. And what happened is that the highest quality work came from 2 groups of students. The group of students who had fixed deadlines, and the other one was students who set deadlines at evenly spaced intervals so that they set deadlines roughly a third of the way through the semester. The students who recognized that the best way for them to do it is to set all the deadlines on the last day of the semester, because that way they could never be late if they, even though they may have planned to do work along the way. They ended up with much lower quality work. The papers were shorter. They had more spelling and grammatical errors. They were reviewed by a separate, panel anonymously, faculty, and it resulted in dramatically lower, about a letter grade or so, lower quality work on average when students had flexibility without any sort of penalty, because we all tend to procrastinate. And, there's thousands of studies which show this in behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, and so forth. So some structure is good, but some flexibility is good, but the balance is important. And that's especially important for neurodiverse students who, when they do not have structure, actually tend to do much less well. And that's one of the main things that Vijay Sathi and Kelly Hogan in their book on inclusive teaching and a lot of studies have found to be really important. And, especially in STEM disciplines where how you do later on the material depends on what you've learned earlier. So if you don't have a solid foundation on the basic concepts, you're not going to be able to get caught up as you get progressively further and further behind. So that sort of balance is important. Being flexible with students is important, but giving them some guidance and basic structure to make it more likely that they won't be caught by procrastination, because we all tend to do that, as you'll see by the crappy slides I put together.
All right, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and we do just have 2 minutes left. So I will say that if you are starting to, if you are thinking about your assignments and student engagement and, teaching that general education course where you're going to have a whole bunch of different people in it with a whole bunch of different feelings, I would strongly encourage everyone to take a look at the TILT framework, which I think is just a really nice way not only to be inclusive in your courses, but to be really clear about what the purpose of your assignment is, what your students have to do, and what criteria they have to follow. So, you know, being transparent in this way and saying, you know, like this, the purpose of this assignment is to help you improve your critical thinking skills, like for example, right? Or whatever it might be. Students are sometimes more motivated to do something if they can see what the outcomes are supposed to be for them, right? Or what they are supposed to gain from it. And, you know, like helping our students see that, like, yes, like I understand you're taking this course, and you might not be super jazzed about it, but like we're going to help you develop X, Y, and Z things, which will help you down the road or in your other courses or like in your personal life or whatever, right? There's a chance that they're going to be kind of like more, they're going to have more buy-in. And then, all right, so unfortunately we don't have time for these, but I will go back, and if you are interested in seeing some of the student testimonials that I included here, sort of about their feelings on AI and how it's happening in the classroom, then feel free to scan the Dino. And there's a couple of other things on here too. I'm sorry that I ran out of time, but thank you for the good conversation. Does anybody have any brief comments before we turn it off? Oh, thanks, Eric. Hang on. All right, well, thank you, everyone. If you're all set, then you are free to go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.